Media, black, white, or grey. Media, as we know it, has a long history, starting from a newspaper press appearing as early as 100 BC to the convenient press of a button that we now know as digital media. There are so many forms of media like television, radio, cinema, newspapers, magazines, internet based websites, etc. But to truly understand the concept of media, we have to understand the amount of influence that it has on us. Survey says in 2020, over 50% of India's population was accessing social networks, and it was estimated that by 2025, this penetration of social networks would be 67% of the country's population. Media has been super helpful in many ways. Social media sites like Facebook have become an inevitable part of modern life. It helps you connect with your friends instantly and in real time. Users can interact, reconnect, and socialize. Social media like LinkedIn has become a major resource of employment. More than 89% recruitments take place by using LinkedIn and company websites. A 140-word tweet contains a world of information. It keeps you informed it keeps you informed about the world and your interests. And it even helped people during the COVID pandemic as India's devastating second wave of coronavirus outbreak overwhelmed the healthcare system. Desperate users turned to social media to seek help from the public as hospital beds and oxygen supplies ran out. People in need of assistance, either for themselves or their relatives, posted requests on sites such as Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram. Others collated information on the availability of beds in hospitals, as well as contact details of vendors with oxygen cylinders and other resources in short supply. And in many instances, the efforts helped save lives. Twitter hashtags like hashtag COVIDSOS and hashtag COVIDEmergency became popular among users searching for hospital beds, ventilators, and oxygen cylinders, and the retweet function helped amplify their requests. Strangers banded together to help one another weather the unprecedented crisis. But even with so many advantages, there are many cons to media as well. Many users use social media for time pass, but excessive and uncontrolled use can lead to severe addiction. Excessive use of the internet can lead to deterioration in concentration. And while working on social media, you constantly keep switching from one task to another. Your ability to concentrate on one task gets impaired, and such an activity also tires your brain. Information abundance leads to brain fatigue and stress. You must have noticed that whenever you start your work or do something over the internet, the first thing you do is check your personal profiles. It actually wastes a lot of productive time. Not to mention that social media has opened up a possibility of identity theft, data theft, cyber fraud, hacking, and virus attacks, and you are left with no privacy. But these are just the tip of the iceberg, and there are so many more problems with media than what meets the eye. One of the main problems being media bias. Media bias is the bias of journalists and news producers within the mass media in the selection of many events and stories that are reported and how they are covered. The term media bias implies a pervasive or widespread bias contravening the standards of journalism. At first glance, this might not really seem like a big issue, but as I said earlier, more than half of our country uses social media, and so that equals nearly 70 crore people using media platforms to get reliable facts. So bias in these platforms can equal many of them getting misleading information. And this is just in India. Imagine if it happened worldwide. There can be many types of bias in the media. For example, advertising bias and corporate bias, when stories are selected or slanted to please advertisers and corporate owners of media respectively. Another type includes mainstream bias, where media has a tendency to report what everyone else is reporting and to avoid stories that will offend anyone. But above all, the most severe outcome of bias or controlled media is that it is a threat to our democracy. Even before the pandemic, media bias in India existed across the largest newspapers throughout the country, and political forces shape this bias. For example, funds from the government are critical to many newspapers' operations and budgets, and the government has previously refused to advertise with newspapers that do not support its initiatives. And this pressure leads media to endorse government policies, creating unbalanced reporting. Many media outlets enjoy a symbiotic relationship with the government, in turn, receiving attention, funding, and prominence. And these trends damage India's democracy. The ability of media bias to influence political support in India can contribute significantly to democratic backsliding by harming journalists, preventing freedom of expression and government accountability, and influencing voters. Media bias in politics means that media will neither hold the government accountable nor inform the public about policies that strengthen the incumbent's power. This can lead to authoritarian practices. In addition, government efforts to help to constrain media harms journalists, undemocratically violating citizens' rights and physical safety. As the COVID-19 pandemic rages out of control in India, many are rightly focusing on the content of stories, on the death toll, and months of lockdown. And the lack of journalistic integrity behind some of the stories deepens this grim situation. In April, reports emerged that, at the request of the Indian government, Twitter censored 52 tweets criticizing the government's handling of the pandemic. Meanwhile, pro-government TV channels blamed the farmers' protests for limited oxygen supplies for COVID-19 patients. Those supplies were actually scarce due to the poor public health infrastructure. And while talking about the farmers' protest, another example of media bias can be seen while reporting the incident on Republic Day last year, where several media outlets claimed that the protesters took down the Indian national flag and replaced the tricolour with the Khalistan flag. But the truth is that the protesters hoisted a flag from an empty pole mast. They neither took down the Indian flag and nor replaced it with the flag of Khalistan, but with Nishan Sahib or Sikh religious flags. The same flags that were also featured on the Punjab tableau during last year's Republic Day parades. And even though this is an illegal activity, the group of protesters were not Khalistan terrorists like biased media outlets claim them to be. Unfortunately, these instances were only a couple out of the many times where media bias has led to the reporting of fake or partial news. So this leads us to the question, how can we overcome media bias? While media bias surrounds us daily and has dire consequences, there are things we can do to help overcome its impact on our daily lives and outlook. We could start by getting news from less biased media outlets. And as much as we'd like to say, getting news from unbiased media outlets, it's hard to find a news source that completely lacks bias. Although it may seem impossible to get news from an article that doesn't skew in a particular direction, by reading news from sources that are known for eliminating bias in their reporting, you can avoid having your viewers manipulated. Next, we should read content from multiple sources. For example, after a political debate, read multiple articles about the debate from sources ranging in affiliations, and this way, you don't solely rely on information coming from one end of the political spectrum. Finally, it is important to engage in discussions without biased moderation. Rather than succumbing to the moderation-filled comment sections and social media channels of biased news networks, it's important to find ways to engage in discussions free from those biases. And yes, these solutions are not easy or effortless, but just know that every time you work towards overcoming media bias, you are making a difference. While it's hard to completely avoid media bias, the best way to overcome it is by fully understanding what it is and your relationship to it. Whether it's beginning by acknowledging that your go-to news outlet has biases and making a conscious effort to identify and understand them as you read your news, or by wanting to engage in discussions solely on bias-free platforms. By mitigating these biases, you can take steps towards overcoming them. To conclude, I would like to say, media on its own is neither black or white. It is a means to an end, a tool, and a powerful one at that. But how media platforms will be used is up to us, the people. And so that makes it our responsibility to make sure that media is being used for the right reasons. Thank you.